Hello, my name is Bob Kenny, and I'm here today to talk with you about team development through the perspective of trust, building, maintaining, and perhaps even rebuilding the trust inside your team that really is at the core of the important work that you're able to do. This is a part of the Building Management Skills for Prevention Professionals video series, and I'm happy to be with you here today. Before we move any further, I'd just like to ask you please to read through this slide. Okay, here's where I'd like to begin. What comes to mind when you think of the word trust? I suspect, like many words, like the word trust, there are probably about as many definitions as there are people who've tried to define it. However, I think that there are probably some common denominators, and I've got a few sort of classic descriptions or definitions here on this slide. It really does make an enormous difference in the degree to which you and I are able to accomplish and work collaboratively with other people on the job. So I'd like you to just stop and think right now about your team. Think about the people who you call team members. And of course, team could also mean people outside the day-to-day team that you may be a part of, perhaps even your clients and customers. But when you think about team, I'd like you to just think about what role trust plays inside this team. When you have trust with those whom you have trust inside your teams, what are you able to accomplish because of that? What are you personally able to accomplish? And what is your team together able to accomplish because of the trust that you experience in the relationships that you've built with each other? Now, when it comes to figuring out who actually gets to determine whether somebody else is trustworthy, guess who that person is? It's you. You are the one who gets to determine the degree to which you trust the other people around you. Just like those people are the ones who get to determine the degree to which they trust you. So when it comes to trust, since trust really is in the eyes of the beholder, I think it's important to look at it from the point of view of all of those beholders, or what I'm calling your team members. So I want to share with you a tool that I like to use when I'm engaged in any kind of a team building or team development project. When we're talking about trust, I like to give people an opportunity to first each individually identify, what is it that I look for to determine those whom I can indeed trust? And what kinds of things might break the trust that I have for other people? So we're not going to do these two, I call them thought experiments. We're not going to do these two thought experiments, but I want to provide this to you in addition to a follow-up set of handouts or workbook that will help you to have a conversation inside your teams about what I call trust factors and distrust factors. So if you were to do this inside your team, what I'd recommend that you do is you yourself and everybody else on your team takes 3 minutes to answer the questions for one public figure, meaning really anybody who kind of has a high level profile, perhaps somebody in the community or somebody in the news, but give everybody a chance in their own minds, saying nothing to anybody else in the room, to think about that one public figure whom that person currently trusts. And then give them 1 minute to write down all of the reasons why they trust that individual. Then give them an opportunity to think about one friend or family member whom they currently trust. Same question. Why do you trust that person? What is it about that person? their behaviors, their characteristics, the way they engage or interact with you, the way they live their life. There's no wrong answer because every answer is the right answer. It's what it takes for you to trust somebody. But then without using any names anywhere, written or spoken, I always ask people to think about one current coworker whom they trust. Why? What is it about that person that has led you to determine that they, in your eyes, are indeed trustworthy? That's a total of 3 minutes. It's a really quick exercise, but it gives each person 1 minute for each of these three individuals to figure out what I call their trust factors. Sometimes following it up with a very similar exercise can help you to help your team members to identify factors related to trust that may have been left out of that first experiment. So I always follow it up with a distrust factor exercise. It works just like the first, except you're giving each team member 3 minutes. For the first minute, they're thinking about one public figure whom they currently distrust and recording why, one friend or family member whom they currently distrust and recording what is it about them that has led them to see them as not trustworthy. And then finally, for sure, no names, spoken or written, one coworker. And if they have to go back to a previous position, a different project, a different team, if they're fortunate enough to be working on a team where trust really is not an issue, then encourage people to think back to other situations they've been in before where they did work with somebody whose trust was in question, and to record for the final minute, what is it or what was it about that person that led them to distrust that individual? And the conversations that happen as a result of that, where people then come back together inside your team and perhaps create two lists. Everybody's contribution is included in the list. We have a whole list, maybe on a whiteboard or a big piece of flip chart paper, but somewhere we have a master list. This is what we as a team each look for to determine whom we can trust. And here's what we look for that can sometimes help us to determine whom we can't trust quite so much. Following up that conversation, of course, should be questions around, so as a team, how can we use this? How can we use this information as we interact with each other? How can we use this information in the way that we communicate with each other and even in what we communicate to each other? How can we use this information in the way that we increase the rapport, the respect, and the appreciation and degree to which we see each other's contributions as valuable resources stemming from this issue of trust? It's a fantastic exercise, and it's a great way to get people talking about something that I find all too often people take for granted. When was the last time you talked to somebody at work about trust? If you're like most people, it probably was quite a while ago, if ever. So don't take it for granted. Don't cross your fingers and hope it happens on purpose. I'm sorry, hope it happens by mistake, but make it happen on purpose. And it's a very simple way to do so. Now, I want to share some other information with you, but before I go into some detail about content and how you might be able to think about this in a slightly different way, one other question I always find interesting to ask the teams with whom I'm doing this are the essentially two that you see on the screen now. Do you have any trust deal makers? Is there something that just really stands out for you that sort of makes up for somebody not being perfect? I can deal with X and I can deal with Y, but if somebody has this Z thing all wrapped up, this is somebody whom I can trust. This is my deal maker when it comes to trusting other people. This is a must-have, and oftentimes it's something that can fill in for things that might not be there, that for someone else I might find important. I also have found, however, that for some people there are deal breakers. No matter what you do, no matter what you say or how you say it, if you possess this one characteristic, one trait, or engage in this one behavior, the trustworthiness that I have for you may indeed go out the window. Now, when it comes to looking for the deal breakers and deal makers, keep in mind that not everybody has one. Some people see all of their trust factors and distrust factors as equally important and equally contributing to the degree to which they feel this sense of trust. But it's important to know that some of us out here do prioritize the trust and distrust factors. So that could just add to the level of detail or depth with which your team talks about what's most important to them. Now, I want to share with you some information as a follow-up from two of my favorite books on trust. Now, this individual, his name, however, may look familiar to you. He's Stephen Covey, but he's not the original Stephen Covey from 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, First Things First, and some other publications you may remember back in starting out in the 1990s. Late 1980s really is when Covey hit the business sector. But his son, Stephen M.R. Covey, has written 2 of what I consider to be the best books on trust. The first one's called The Speed of Trust, second one called Smart Trust. But I want to share with you some of the information that I'm inspired to include in this overview on trust, coming directly from the work that Covey and his team covers in both of these books. Because let's face it, there may be opportunities where you can't, or it's too awkward, or would be strange for you to actually ask somebody, so, hey, what's it going to take for you to trust me? Sometimes you just need to kind of figure it out through observation. But one of the things that Covey did and included in his books was come up with what they call their 13 trust building behaviors. These 13 behaviors are things that most people, including those strangers out there whom you don't work with, or maybe if it's a new hire, or maybe you're the new hire and you've never worked with these individuals before, these are the kinds of things that oftentimes you and I can just assume it's probably some combination of these 13 variables that for most people are going to have a positive impact on the degree to which they see me as being trustworthy. I'm not talking about, oh, I want to be manipulative and get somebody to trust me when they really shouldn't. I'm talking about I have these important relationships, and my ability to create success for myself and the others around me rests in part in the kinds of relationships that they and I have with each other. So again, rather than crossing my fingers and hoping you and I find a way to trust each other, this is something that you might be able to work out and make happen on purpose. Talking straight, letting people know in a very clear way exactly what you're talking about, showing people the degree to which, and telling people the degree to which you respect and appreciate what they do, how they do it, and the value that they add. Creating transparency so people don't have to say, I wonder what Bob's thinking, or I wonder what he meant by that, or I think this is what he's trying to say, but I'm not sure. Righting wrongs, I don't know about you, but every now and then I make mistakes. Rather than saying, I hope nobody saw that. Maybe if I say nothing, I can get away with it. People who are looking for somebody to be trustworthy typically is willing to admit mistakes and perhaps even make amends. Showing loyalty, letting people know that indeed you care deeply about not only your own success, but the success that they themselves experience at work, given what their responsibilities are, and also making sure that all that they could contribute to what's happening inside your team, if you're a manager, is being explored through, for instance, the delegation, the coaching, and other situations where a manager might be able to sit with somebody and help them to see how important their success is if you happen to be in a supervisory role. Giving credit freely, not telling people only when they make mistakes, but actually letting people know when they've done a good job instead of holding on to it so you can soften the blow when they do something wrong and you want to try to make it a little less difficult. Letting people know when they do things well is a part of what Covey and his team have identified as showing loyalty. Delivering results, people who do what they say, people who come through for you, people whom you can depend on and who are reliable. But people also who are able to recognize that they're not perfect and they're always looking for ways to get better. Confronting reality rather than pretending, for instance, that conflict doesn't exist. Being able to talk about the tough things that need to be talked about and being able to tell me things that I need to know, not just what I want to know, is also a part of confronting reality. Don't tell me what your expectations are in some sort of language that I have to decipher, but let me know exactly what you expect and be open to my clear expectations in the way that the two of us work together. If I'm in your trustworthy uh, category, and probably also going to be practicing accountability. I'm going to be holding myself accountable and responsible for what I'm there to do, but I'm also going to be looking to other people to follow through and be held accountable. Stephen M. R. Covey's dad said it, his sixth of 7 habits for highly effective people was seek first to understand before trying to be understood. I'm not sure if that's part of what inspired Covey to take a look at this, but listen first, collect information, understand what the other person's trying to tell you before trying to give them a hand or answering the question, following through and keeping your commitments, and then not being afraid to actually extend your trust to others. Trust can lead to trust. I trust you. You may then look at me as somebody perhaps who in your eyes also is worthy of trust. It does happen more times than you may realize. Now, the last couple of things that I want to share with you about this Covey work and trust involve a metaphor and a reality. And it's one of my favorite ways of sharing with people how you and I can think about trust and how we can build trust and maintain it as well. Now, Covey talks about trust in terms of a metaphor being sort of like, yes, an ATM machine, but it's sort of like a bank account. And let's call it a checking account. And if you engage in behaviors that are consistent with my trust factors, remember we talked about that earlier, then that's sort of like you making deposits into the bank account that I have in your name that represents the degree to which I trust you. The higher the balance, the more I trust you. You do something that warrants my trust or is a trust factor, you're making a deposit. Now, if you make a withdrawal or engage in one of my distrust factors, well, that's like taking money, credits, or trust out of the account, and I may trust you less. It changes. My account balance in my checking account today may be higher or lower than it was yesterday, depending on whether I've made any deposits or made any withdrawals. The same is true with trust. It does go up, it can go down, but it's a measure of the degree of trust that somebody has in you at any given point in time. Now, the reality is that each trust account is unique. What it takes for me to trust you may be different from what it takes for you to trust me. All deposits and withdrawals are not created equal. If you have a deal breaker or a deal maker, a deposit could be exceptionally large or the withdrawal could be exceptionally large. What seems like a deposit to you what seems like a deposit to me may not necessarily be a deposit. So if your account is unique and different from mine, it's quite possible that you may be doing things within our relationship at work that you believe warrants my trust. But in fact, if it's not one of my personal trust factors, it might not have the kind of impact that you would expect it to have, which is why it's so important, I believe, to get people talking about this and not making assumptions. Well, if this is important to me, if this is what builds trust in my eyes, oh, then it must also be what's important to you. That's not always the case. In fact, it's often not the case. It's also important to realize that withdrawals typically are larger than deposits. You've probably heard the old cliche, it can take years to build trust, but it could take just a second or two to break it. And then sometimes you can build trust faster just by not making any withdrawals. That's kind of like building interest. The fact that I have trust in you over time, I do believe you need to continuously show me that you still deserve my trust. But I think there is an opportunity for the account balance to go up higher when you just leave it alone and just don't make any of the withdrawals that might get me to start questioning whether or not you're somebody whom I can trust. But for any two people, there will always be two accounts, one in your eyes for me and one in my eyes for you. Now, when it comes to these trust factors and distrust factors, and when it comes to Covey's 13 trust building behaviors, we're looking to get into that sweet spot, because too little of one of Covey's 13 behaviors could be seen as a weakness, but so could too much. Remember that first one, it was called straight talk. Imagine, well, let me ask it to you this way. Do you know anybody who just has no filters? Something comes to mind and they say it, and then you're thinking, are you as shocked at what just came out of your mouth as I am? That's somebody who's a straight talker, but maybe who has not found a way to balance it with a little bit of respect, a little bit of self-awareness, perhaps. So we're looking for the sweet spot. Each of those trust factors that we have, each of those 13 trust building behaviors that Covey and his team talk about, too little can be hard to see and not make much of a difference, but too much could be almost suffocating and perhaps be seen as almost aggressive. So the sweet spot, that's where the strength lies when it comes to building trust with people. Because when it comes to trust, like a vehicle, a relationship without trust is like a vehicle without fuel. It can't move ahead. So I hope that you've picked up a few ideas that will give you some momentum to go back and talk with your team members about exactly what it takes to build trust in their eyes, so that it can be done on purpose and your team can move ahead with the important work that it's responsible for. And I thank you. Kristen, I'm wondering if you had any thoughts on what I've shared with folks.
Yeah, one question that comes to mind, I think you addressed this a little bit, is if you were coming into a new role as a manager or a supervisor, and you found that there was a pre-existing lack of trust, what steps would somebody take in that role to kind of start fresh and build a new relationship, maybe without knowing all of the dynamics that had existed before?
Well, I think part of the solution is to understand the dynamics that happened before you got there, especially if you're in a supervisor role. It's going to be important for you to ask questions that, if I were not a supervisor, I'm not so sure if I would come into a new team and start saying, hey, what went wrong before I got here? I mean, I'll probably figure it out. I'll probably hear about it over time. But if I'm in a supervisory or management role, I really need to get to know my team members, and in some ways need to understand the history because they have the institutional history. I don't. And for me to come in and work as if I've been here all along, to a lot of people can sometimes appear, I'm not sure if condescending is the right word, maybe presumptuous. So it would be really important to talk with people about perhaps one-on-one, about the misses, the things that perhaps just didn't work out, maybe with the previous manager or supervisor. But keep in mind that as you're talking with people about this, that you could also ask questions like, if you could do it again, or if they could do it again, how could things be different? Or how would you have liked to have seen things work out differently? And as you ask those kinds of questions, I find that you're very likely to get people talking about what I've referred to as their trust factors, as well as their distrust factors, without actually doing any of those so-called thought experiments that I shared with you earlier. There are just lots of ways of having these conversations with people to really tap into what it takes. And sometimes we can learn from others' mistakes just as well as we can learn from others' successes. So I would recommend having, especially one-on-one conversations with people to try to figure out what those trust and distrust factors are. And then talk with people about the moving forward and where do we go from here. And here are some of the things that I've discovered as a team we tend to have in common in terms of expectations for your managers and supervisors. And here's what I'm willing to do in order to make some of these things happen.
Great. Thank you.
Absolutely. Okay, folks, thank you so much for joining this particular video. We'll see you next time.